Hi everybody, today is Friday, November 29th, and our friend Dmitry Orlov is back with us. Welcome back, Dmitry.
Good to be with you.
Let's get started with the conflict in Ukraine. It seems that in the West they're talking about freezing the conflict. What does it mean in the eyes of Russians?
Nothing at all. Um, you can't freeze something that you don't control. Russia is not willing to freeze anything. Russia is moving forward. There is nothing that the U.S. or the others don't really matter, but there's nothing that the U.S. can say or do that will cause the Russians to agree to freeze a conflict on what they consider their soil. They're, they're Ukrainian troops on Russian soil. They have to be thrown out. And then there's the question of what to do with the rest of the Ukraine, which is, um, from the Russian point of view, an ungoverned territory under partial US NATO occupation. And so NATO has to be thrown out of there. That's the task for Russia. And it seems to be quite doable. Um, the the Americans seem confused. They think that the Ukraine is like Korea. The Ukraine is not like Korea. The Ukraine is like Vietnam, and so they have to change their thinking. Otherwise, nothing good will happen.
Is that coming with the Trump administration and the people that he has chosen to be part of his administration?
Well, Kit Kellogg is old enough that this will be his last mission. He has started in Vietnam, so he knows what failure is like and how it is achieved. And so his task is once again to achieve failure, since there's no good outcome for the United States. And the best he can do really in this situation is to make sure that it is perceived as Biden's war as opposed to Trump's war, although Trump did a lot to get it going by arming the Ukrainians. And so what can he do? Nothing that he's actually saying makes any sense to the Russians. So he wants the Russians to negotiate with the Zelensky regime, which is currently in a bunker, I understand, waiting to get killed, I suppose, or maybe commit suicide, who knows. But why would Russians want to talk to the Ukrainians, having said that they're basically a bunch of prisoners, a bunch of war criminals, and they have a few choices. They can kill themselves, they can be killed, or they can surrender and stand trial and then possibly get executed. So that there aren't really any good options for them. The best option for them is to run away um, to Miami Beach or whatever. But it doesn't seem like the Americans actually want that to happen.
Yeah. Here is, since you've mentioned Keith Kellogg, let me play a clip of him and assessing the conflict in Ukraine.
What I'm really hoping. I'm hoping that Jake Sullivan talked to Michael Waltz, who's the incoming national security advisor, or President Biden has talked to President Trump and said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm really hoping that happens because what he has done, Biden, through his action, he's actually given President Trump more leverage.
Really?
Because now he can pull back, he can go left, he can go right, he can do something. And I think what he did is he basically said, well, this is what I want to do. And I'm hoping there's something to this. I don't know. But it does give the President Trump more ability to pivot from that.
Oh, that's interesting. All right.
I just
Yeah. He's mentioning that whatever the Biden administration does in terms of escalation in the conflict in Ukraine, as we know with the law, with these attacks hitting Russian soil, it seems that in the eyes of these people who are coming to the Trump administration, that would be a good strategy on their part. How good is that in
Well,
your
well, I think that they're they're talking sports, and this isn't sports. And so, Mr. Cornflakes thinks that, Biden, he's doing something and that's good because now Trump can bob and weave and fiddle and diddle and dribble and whatever. What does that have to do with anything? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. So, the interesting thing that happened is now you can pretty much take NATO's Article 5 and throw it in the fireplace, because no NATO country can defend any other NATO country from the Russians. The Russians now have a non-nuclear way to hit any of them anytime, and do that without fear of any kind of reprisal, really, because none of the NATO countries can either stop Russia. All of the air defense systems are useless against Oreshnik. And they can't hit Russia, as has been demonstrated with everything that they've thrown at Russia so far. So they should just give up, but they can't give up, because giving up means quitting their jobs and giving up on their political careers. Plus, there's nobody to replace them. So there's this basically cycle of denial. Right now they're in denial. I think they'll eventually move on to anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance, but that may take a long time.
In terms of the relationship between the United States and Russia, we had a long history. And when we look at the ABM Treaty, INF Treaty, and right after that, the war in Ukraine, do you think all of them together would make some sort of mindset in Russia to change its strategy, its military strategy, in terms of, because they may say that at the end of the day, they're not going to negotiate in a good faith. They're not capable of having that sort of relationship. And right now, with the fight in Ukraine, what's going on in the mind of Russian army, in your opinion? And
well, the Americans,
Go ahead.
Well, the Americans keep talking about negotiating from a position of strength. And that sounds great to the Russians. So the Russians are going to do just that. They're going to negotiate from a position of strength. So the problem there is that the Americans think that they're the strong ones. They have to be disabused of that notion, possibly in kinetic ways. And Russia has a way to do that. Russia now has weapons, and other weapon systems are coming along really nicely, non-nuclear weapons that can be used to hit just about any US installation anywhere. All of these army bases that the US has, without any fear of reprisal, because this is not nuclear escalation. These are non-nuclear devices. They're not weapons of mass destruction. They're just pinpoint weapons that will neutralize this or that American or NATO installation. And if the Americans in response are suicidal, then they could stage a nuclear attack. But if they're not suicidal, then there's really nothing they can do except suck it up. The Americans are not really inured to the idea of sucking it up. And so it may take a while, and the lessons may have to be repeated several times before the message sinks in. But the Americans eventually will be forced to realize that it is over. They need to just go home.
How about the people who are going to work with Donald Trump? Do you think these people are going to help him in what he was going to do? At least he was talking about before 2024 presidential election. If you remember, before 2024 presidential election, he said that they're escalating the conflict in Ukraine. We have to stop this. But with the ATACMS being used against Russia, we haven't heard from him so far. Was that a campaign rhetoric, and right now, or he's trying to do something, or he feels, as General Keith Kellogg pointed out, that would help him in his attitude, in his sort of negotiations with Russia?
Well, I don't think that there will be any negotiations with Russia, because Ukraine is Russia's problem, and Russia would like the United States to please get out of there, nicely or not so nicely. The question is, what kinds of persuasive means will Russia need to use? Now, the noises coming out of various parts of the Russian state are not very promising as far as what the Americans might expect. So the Russians are wondering, for instance, are the Americans digging mass graves for their soldiers? Because that's something that they ought to do ahead of time. Either that, or they can just pull their troops out of Europe and the Middle East and various other places and just take their ball and go home. That would be very nice, but the Americans don't seem to be quite ready for it. So in terms of negotiation with the Americans, the Russians have already tried that. They're not going to try it again. The United States does not have the reputation of a credible negotiating partner. It has the reputation of a rogue. And so the Russians have no reason, acting from a position of strength, to actually, stoop down to these American antics and to listen to American rhetoric and nonsense. They can just move on with the task at hand, which is cleaning up what's left of the Ukraine.
We had Mike Waltz, the next national security advisor, who said that he had a meeting with Jake Sullivan in which he feels that he's totally in line with the policy of the Biden administration or their strategy. On the other hand, we've learned that the United States is forcing Ukrainians to reduce the draft age from 25 to 18. And do you see the conflict in Ukraine continuing the way that we've seen so far, or these are all, as we know, making some sort of move on the part of the West to help the position of Ukrainians in any sort of talks?
Well, it's a funny thing. You see, the Americans just want to exterminate all the Ukrainians. They want the Ukraine as real estate. They don't want the Ukraine as a country with people living in it. So BlackRock and various other U.S. entities have bought up the real estate and bought up the mineral reserves of the Ukraine, including ones that are now under Russian control. Most of the mineral wealth of the Ukraine is in the east of the country, which is now Russian territory. So they bought it up, and what are these Ukrainians doing sitting on American soil? That's what they're thinking. So the more Ukrainians they manage to feed into this meat grinder and get destroyed using Russian artillery, the better it will be, they think. But there's a bit of a problem. You see, the Ukraine no longer exists as a sovereign entity. Its borders were defined by a deal that was signed in the 90s, granting the Ukraine independence from the Soviet Union in exchange for neutrality, nuclear disarmament, and friendly relations with Russia. The Ukraine has chosen not to renew that treaty, the Friendship and Cooperation Agreement. Therefore, there are no borders between Russia and the Ukraine, none. And there's also no recognition of Ukrainian sovereignty. The Ukraine is no longer a country that can stamp a deed with an apostille so that the Russian government would be forced to recognize it. So those deeds that BlackRock, for instance, purchased from the Ukrainian government against the wishes of the people are nothing. They're waste paper. And so there's this slaughter that's going on, but the end result of it will be that all of these acquisitions that the Americans believe that they've made in the Ukraine are null and void. They were made through an illegitimate government by illegitimate means.
Does Russia take the allegation on the part of the United Kingdom and France to send their troops to Ukraine seriously? Is that going to be a serious issue for Russia, in your opinion?
Yes. The thing is, the Russians, they kill Ukrainians when the Ukrainians are actually actively shooting at them. But other than that, they're quite sparing. And when it comes to attacks with the new weapon, Oreshnik, they promised to give warning to Ukrainian non-combatants so that they could get out of the way ahead of time. That would not be the deal for the Brits or the French. If the Brits or the French are found on Ukrainian territory, they will simply be killed. So in response to these discussions that the British and the French had about sending their troops under their own flag in their uniform into the Ukraine, the Russian question was, well, have you dug the mass graves yet? Because those people will die. That's all that'll happen. You will send them there. We will kill them. The end.
How do you see the role of Germany right now? What are we hearing from Germany? Do you think that they're still having some sort of support for the Biden administration and the way that they're trying to escalate the conflict in Ukraine, or they're getting to the point that Donald Trump is coming and he may change the situation in Ukraine?
Well, there's a lot of hysteria having to do with the fact that there's nothing useful to be done. Every single party in Germany is somehow making hay of the fact that there's a war going on. They're against it one way or another. They are for winning against Russia. They're for containing Russia, whatever that means. They may be for or against this or that aspect of it. But the war is very useful for them as a talking point, because if it wasn't there, they would have to discuss the fact that their auto industry has just collapsed. That they would have to talk about the fact that half their people won't be able to pay their bills to keep their houses through the winter. They will have to talk about the fact that the new administration in Washington will impose even more tariffs on manufactured products from Germany, killing what's left of German industry. All of those discussions would have to go on. So they're very happy that there's this war going on in the Ukraine, because it gives them a chance to basically talk a bunch of BS instead of discussing no-win issues having to do with the fact that, Germany is really gradually collapsing. Its past peak, its peak of development, industrial production was in 2008. All of this industrial might that Germany used to have as the powerhouse of Europe is definitely in the rearview mirror now. And so that is not something that can be easily communicated to the German electorate in a way that will allow anyone to get their vote. So they're grateful for this war, and they'll do whatever little thing they can to keep the war going, although at this point it's really not much.
One of the main concerns, Dmitry, in Ukraine is what's going on right now in Syria. We have two cities, Idlib and Aleppo, against the government in Syria. And I think the future concern would be what's going on to the western part of Ukraine. Are they going to be the same way that we're witnessing right now in Syria? They're sending many people from various countries to fight against the government in Syria. How do you feel about that? How do you see the West going in that direction? Because that would be a forever war for Russia.
No, not necessarily. Russia has a really handy way of destroying all these militants in Syria. It's done it before. This is something that had to be cleaned up at some point. Idlib became a gremlin province where these untouchable jihadis were trucked in from all over Syria. And it was supposed to be Turkey's task to somehow civilize them, but Turkey didn't do it. Wasn't up to the task, and instead, Americans did their usual thing of organizing a bunch of terrorists. And now they use the fact that what happened in Palestine has severely weakened some of the forces that were helping defend the Syrian government. And so this attack was really an act of opportunism. But the fact is that the Syrians were taken by surprise, and to some extent the Russians were too. But now they're moving troops in, and it may take a bit of time, but I don't think those forces will take over Aleppo. I would be surprised if that happens again. And I think the ultimate workout of the situation would be to clean up Idlib, to actually say, no, Turkey is not going to be in control of Idlib, and neither are the Americans. We have to chase all of those people out of there, either that or kill them. Russia has helped that process a great deal in the past and can do so again. You have to keep in mind that only about a quarter of the Russian military is involved in the Ukraine right now. The rest of it is training or idle. And so there is no reason why Russia couldn't help in Syria as well.
Is that related to the ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel? How do you see? Because was that a coincidence in the way that the day that they announced they're going to have a ceasefire, we had this attack in Syria. How do you see these two together?
Oh, well, I think overall, I think it was opportunism. It was seeing the Palestinian faction weakened, and it was in support of the Syrian government. And so this was sort of a good chance. They saw this opportunity. In terms of the ceasefire, which isn't really a ceasefire, because one side isn't party to it. It's between Israel and the Lebanese government. Now, the Lebanese government is not really party to the conflict. The party to the conflict didn't sign on. So that's a very interesting sort of ceasefire where one side isn't part of the deal. Now, the reason it was signed was basically because the Americans wanted to claim some kind of a Pyrrhic victory in order to resume arms shipments to Israel. That was a condition. You sign a ceasefire and we'll send you some more weapons so you can blow up some more Palestinians. So that happened. But other than that, what it means is another Israeli defeat in southern Lebanon, number 3. So now anybody thinks that Israel can do anything constructive in terms of securing its own interests by fighting a war in southern Lebanon, that at this point seems a really outlandish claim. They've been defeated 3 times in a row.
How about seeing the conflict in a way that we have some sort of ceasefire in between Israel and Lebanon, but to keep Russia busy with the conflict, they started the conflict in Syria while they're having some sort of escalation in Ukraine. How do you see in that direction?
I think Russia can fly sorties to Syria as well as to Ukraine. That's not a problem. It would mean that a slightly more of their aircraft and pilots would be occupied. It may mean that the Ukrainian campaign will take a tiny bit longer, but you have to keep in mind that bombs that they're using have been stockpiled a long time ago. It isn't really something that the Russians have to keep producing. The stockpiles already exist. The aircraft already exist. The pilots have already been trained. So it's just a matter of turning on a spigot. It's not something that needs to be organized. The base in Hmeimim has already been established. All of that has been tested. The coordination with the Syrians has been worked out. There isn't really a problem. It's just a matter of firing it all up again. And, it's a shame that there was an effort by the Syrians to negotiate with Turkey. Turkey is, after all, a NATO member and lacks the ability to determine its own fortunes because it has to comply with American demands. And of course, what the Americans did was what they always do, which is make trouble for the Syrian government. And so this is cleanup phase 2. ISIS was destroyed. So now these ISIS remnants in Idlib that have been festering there for a decade, now they have to be destroyed again. This is cleanup phase 2.
How do you see the behavior of the Turkish government? The way that in the conflict in Ukraine and right now in the Middle East, how do you see the way that they're making their policies would be in their benefit in the long-term strategy, in something for not a short-term strategy, for something to come in the future for them, and in terms of, because right now it doesn't seem that they have any sort of a strategy. I don't know if you remember recently Erdogan was talking about condemning Russia for what's doing in Ukraine, and right now, as you mentioned, in Syria, they're so unreliable, in my opinion, when you look at the behavior of the Turkish government after all.
Well, Turkey has a problem. It has several million Syrians on its soil. And the Turks are absolutely sick of having all of these Syrians living in Turkey. And what they would like to do is for those Syrians to go back to Syria. And that is something that Erdogan has actually promised. So in order to do that, he has to, I suppose, establish some kind of a base in Syria. Maybe his dream is to take over Aleppo and extend Turkish control over Aleppo, which is the largest city in Syria, and then say, okay, all of these Syrians are being expelled from Turkey and they can go to Aleppo, which we control. Maybe that's his dream. I don't think that that's actually reasonable. The actual solution is to lift all sanctions on Syria, rebuild Syria, and make it an attractive place for the Syrians to go back home. But the problem with that is the Americans. The problem is the Americans are still stuck in this Assad must go mode, although they kept saying it because some American official says it, and then that American official, is out of office, but Assad is still there. So it's kind of a joke. So, but the Americans, they're famous for being sore losers. They lost in Syria, and instead of declaring defeat, they want to lose in Syria again and again and again, because somehow that's less painful for them than admitting that they've lost. Look at how long they've maintained sanctions on Cuba, where they lost a really long time ago. How many years has it been since the Bay of Pigs disaster, and they still maintain sanctions on Cuba because they can't just say, okay, we lost, let's just start from a clean slate and be reasonable. So that's the big problem. And what Turkey would really need is some kind of a cooperative agreement with Syria, minus the Americans, minus American influence in the region, and then good things would begin to happen.
You mentioned that the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon is not between Hezbollah and Israel. Do you think that with what we've seen so far in southern Lebanon, is Israel learning a lesson to how to fight with Hezbollah, or they're gonna attack again southern Lebanon?
Well, are they capable of learning anything at all at this point? I've seen no sign of that. Basically, they kept fighting until they started running out of everything, losing lots of tanks. The Israeli military has a huge problem with recruiting. They have a lot of people who are refusing to fight. People who've seen a little bit of action claim that they were shell shocked and just have anxiety attacks and therefore can't go back. That's been happening more and more. A lot of people are getting injured and then claiming that they're in chronic pain or something and can't go back and fight. So they're losing people left and right, and there's and they're also losing population because people are sick of this war and sick of hiding in bomb shelters all the time, and they're just leaving. 1 million people left Israel. So and they're running out of ammo. They've all of the stuff that the Americans have sent them. They've run through, destroying apartment buildings in Beirut and bombing Gaza to rubble, with absolutely nothing achieved in terms of strategic military objectives. And so they need more. They need more war material from the United States. So they signed this fake peace deal.
With what we've learned so far from the incoming administration, Donald Trump administration, do you think, mostly pro-Israel, do you think that would help the situation in favor of Israel, or they know that if they go in that direction, it would bring more escalations? That's why they would choose an alternative strategy.
Well, I don't think Trump has a choice but to support Israel, because Israel has so many inroads into the state apparatus in Washington. On the other hand, he wants to reform the U.S. bureaucracy, the U.S. government, which will cause it to stop functioning. And his biggest problem is not getting shot while getting to the point where he becomes president, because his life is in danger, because various parts of the U.S. bureaucracy want him dead, and made no secret of that. So once he's destroyed the U.S. bureaucracy and demoralized them and has to rebuild it but has no money to rebuild it, how much time is he going to have for foreign policy? That's the big question in my mind, is the United States going to be capable of having any foreign policy whatsoever? My feeling is that the United States is going to have a huge problem repatriating its troops from all of the military bases it has scattered around the world when it can no longer pay to keep those people there and can no longer defend them. That is already the case. So if they escalate with Russia, for instance, Russia would respond by destroying some US military bases around the Middle East, in Europe, basically in Alaska, basically wherever they want. And since these are non-military means, and the United States doesn't want to commit suicide by Russia by going nuclear, the Americans will simply have to do nothing. And the best they can do is pull their troops out of harm's way ahead of time, since it is clear now that they cannot defend them and they cannot use them in any productive way, because if Russia has these weapons that the United States cannot defend itself against, pretty soon China and Russia, China and Iran and North Korea and the Houthis, of course, are also going to have those same weapons. And so the Americans really need to work on their denial and get through the stages all the way to depression, and then after that things might get better.
Do you see any sort of will on the part of the Zelensky administration right now, or they don't run the show in Ukraine anymore? Or I don't know if you consider Zelensky or anybody in Ukraine right now, are they capable of making policies toward the conflict, toward the future of the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, he's hiding in a bunker now. You know, they're going underground. And I think that the Russians are going to know where this bunker is precisely. I think the location is already, you know, the GPS coordinates are already in the hands of the Russian Air and Space Corps targeting information. So they don't. The bunker is probably really deep, and it's Zelensky. It's 300 people from administration. It's the parliament. I think the Ukrainian Supreme Court is going to be there with them. And so all the Russians really have to do is blow up the exits, and it's over. It's a mass grave. And that would be a very nice end to this entire Kiev regime. It would be over with definite finality, and it would be one for the history books. They crawled underground and died. You know, that's like one better than what Hitler did. You know, beautiful ending as far as I'm concerned. But that's what they're doing right now. They've discovered that they can't do anything against these new Russian rockets, which are fantastic. I did a little calculations on them, and they're very interesting rockets. The Oreshnik is a breakthrough. It's a complete game changer. So they realized it. The Americans may not have realized it yet, but the Kiev regime has realized it. They realized that they have nothing, and they have a target sign painted on them, and their response is to climb underground.
We've talked about what's going on in the Middle East. One of my main doubts right now is Ukraine going to be the same way that we're witnessing, the same situation that we're witnessing in the West Asia, in Syria, in that region, or Russia would not accept any sort of continuation of the conflict when it decides to put an end to the conflict?
Well, when the front collapses, Russia will pretty much just roll through. There will be nothing to stop it. There are all these discussions that of things that make absolutely no sense. Why don't we introduce some UN troops? Why don't we introduce some British and French troops? Why don't we do this or that? Why don't we freeze the line of contact? These are all dreams. These are pipe dreams. There's nothing there to really talk about or discuss. The Russians will neutralize the entire territory, clean it up. And so there's no comparison between that and what's going on in the Middle East, because there's no superpower involved in the Middle East except maybe the United States. Although the United States is not going to be directly involved because, the United States has its own problems back home. But Russia is really just very delicately and carefully picking at the Ukrainian problem because it's in no hurry. It knows that its actual enemy is the United States, not even NATO. NATO is just a United States puppet. But its enemy is the United States. But the United States is crumbling on the inside. So it's all a matter of time, and there's no reason to rush things. Now, in terms of shoring up Syria, well, Russia shored up Syria before when the situation was really dire, when Syria didn't control as much territory as it does now, when suburbs of Damascus were controlled by enemy forces and they were shelling Damascus itself, when the road between Aleppo and Damascus was impassable, and they solved that problem. So is this problem more severe or less severe than when ISIS was in control? It's less severe. This is ISIS remnants that have been marinating in their own juices in Idlib while being sort of prodded along by the Americans. And now the Americans think, oh, well, this is our chance. This is a good opportunity to do it. The final hooray for the Biden administration or something like that. And so they went ahead with it. I don't know how many days or months it's going to last, but it'll be over at some point.
When this conflict started, Dmitry, we are approaching 3 years of the conflict in Ukraine. And we were all talking about this in those days, and all of these days passing by. And we thought that how the administration in the United States would think that the Ukrainians are capable of defeating Russia militarily. But it seems to me that they really believed in those days that Ukraine is capable of just inflicting huge suffering or maybe defeat on Russian army. Right now, they're talking about the Russia being defeated strategically. Is that, in your opinion, is that still the case in their mind with what's going on, with what has happened so far in Ukraine?
Well, no, they've given up on the idea that the Russians become fed up and overthrow Putin. They've given up on the idea that they will inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. But they have this idea stuck in their minds that the Ukraine can be handled like the Koreas were, draw a line of demarcation and let that be it. The difference is that South Korea was at that time inundated with American troops. And so they could establish that line and actually control it. Whereas there aren't any American troops. Well, 40 Americans killed in Kharkov yesterday, but what's 40 Americans? Nothing. There aren't any American troops in the Ukraine. worth considering. And so they're not in control of the situation. And so the right analogy is not Korea. The right analogy, as I already said, is Vietnam.
Just to wrap up this session, Donald Trump coming to power in 2025. And we are having two major conflicts right now in the Middle East and in Ukraine. And maybe he would be willing to make a new conflict in Taiwan. Do you think that I want you to speculate on this question. How do you see the Trump administration working with Russia, China, Iran, and all of these countries? Is that possible, or he's gonna just make this gap even wider, even worsen the situation and aggravate the situation between the United States and other countries?
Well, like I said, Trump has a lot on his plate domestically. I don't think he'll have any attention or any interest in international politics moving forward. I think that he's going to try to posture in a way that will make him look good internationally, although he will probably realize that there's nothing to be achieved, but he will try to keep up appearances. In terms of committing the United States to a major conflict anywhere at this point, I don't think he's foolish enough to do that. I would be surprised. And I think over the course of his administration, his ability to accomplish anything at all internationally will dwindle. The United States will pretty much fade from the world scene. It is right now sufficient that Article 5 of NATO, you might as well throw it away, because no NATO country can defend any other NATO country against Russia's new weapons systems, which are non-nuclear, so it's not a nuclear escalation. You might as well rip it up. All of the security guarantees that the United States has extended to various countries around the world, such as South Korea, such as Japan, are not worth the paper they're written on. The United States is no longer a world hegemon. It no longer runs the planet, if you will. The problem with the United States is psychological. It's the problem of denial. It's a problem of Americans not having enough mental capacity to realize what sort of a situation they're in. And so accidents might happen, but that's about it. And the only fear I have is that the Americans will go suicidal and will attempt to kill themselves by attacking Russia or one of the other nuclear nations with nuclear means, thinking, oh, they wouldn't dare shoot back at us or something stupid like that. So my only fear is that the Americans will go suicidal. They will persist in denial and become suicidal. And that is quite possible, because if you look at the American population, half of them are popping antidepressants, and lots of the rest are drunk most of the time or on other drugs. And so they're not really competent mentally, a lot of them, including the ones in the federal government or in the defense establishment. And some of the others might actually go suicidal. So that's the big danger for the world.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dmitry, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you very much.